Chapter 25. I first started considering this possibility when you told your story, David, Tia explained. The entire team of reckoners was following her down a tunnel in the steel catacombs. And the more I investigated the bank, the more curious I became. There are oddities. Oddities? I asked. The group moved in a tense huddle, Cody taking point, Abraham watching our tail. He had replaced his very nice machine gun with a similar one, only without quite as many bells and whistles. I felt pretty comfortable with him at our back. These narrow confines would make a heavy machine gun especially deadly to anyone trying to approach us. The walls would work like bumpers on the sides of a bowling lane, and Abraham wouldn't have any trouble at all getting strikes. The diggers, Prof said. He was at my side. They weren't allowed to excavate the area beneath where the bank had stood. Yes, Tia said, speaking eagerly. It was very irregular. Steelheart barely gave them any direction. The chaos of these lower catacombs proves that. Their madness made them hard to control. But one order he was firm on. The area beneath the bank was to be left alone. I wouldn't have thought twice about that if it hadn't been for what you described, that Steelheart had most of the main room of the bank turned to steel by the time Faultline came that afternoon. Her powers had two parts. Yes, I said, too excited not to interrupt. Faultline, the woman Steelheart had brought to bury the bank after I'd escaped. I know. Power duality. Melding two second-tier abilities creates a first-tier one. Tia smiled. You've been reading my classification system notes. I figured we might as well have the same terminology. I shrugged. I have no trouble switching over. Megan glanced at me, the hint of a smile on the corner of her lips. What? I asked. Nerd. I am not. Stay focused, son, Prof said, shooting a hard look at Megan, whose eyes shone with amusement. I happen to have a fondness for nerds. I never said that I didn't, Megan replied lightly. I'm just interested whenever someone pretends to be something they're not. Whatever, I thought. Faultline was a Tier 1 epic by Tia's classification, without an immortality benefit. That made her powerful, but fragile. She should have realized that. When she tried to seize Nukago a few years back, she'd never had a chance. Anyway, she was an epic who had several smaller powers that worked together to create what seemed to be a single, more impressive power. In her case, she could move Earth, but only if it wasn't too rigid. However, she also had the ability to turn ordinary stone and earth into a kind of sandy dust. What had looked like her creating an earthquake had actually been her softening the ground, then pulling back the earth. There were true earthquake-creating epics, but they were, ironically, less powerful, or at least less useful. The stronger ones could destroy a city with their powers, but couldn't bury a single building or a group of people at will. Plate tectonics just worked on too massive a scale to allow for precision. Don't you see? Tia asked. Steelheart turned the bank's main room, walls, much of the ceiling, floor, to steel. Then Faultline began to soften the ground beneath it and let it sink. I started thinking there might be a chance that it would still be there, I said softly. We turned a corner in the catacombs and Tia stepped forward, moving some pieces of junk to reveal a tunnel. I had enough practice by now to tell it was probably tensor-made. The tensors, unless controlled precisely, always created circular tunnels, while the diggers had created square or rectangular corridors. This tunnel burrowed through the steel at a slight decline. Cody walked up, shining his light in. Well, I guess we know what you and Abraham have been working on for the last few weeks, Tia. We had to try several different avenues of approach, Tia explained. I wasn't certain how deep the bank room ended up sinking, or even if it retained structural integrity. But it did? I asked, suddenly feeling a strange numbness. It did, Tia said. It's amazing. Come see. She led the way down the tunnel, which was tall enough to walk through, though Abraham would have to stoop. I hesitated. The others waited for me to follow, so I forced myself forward, joining Tia. The rest of them came along, behind, our mobiles providing the only light. No, wait. There was light up ahead. I could barely make it out, around the shadows of Tia's slender figure. We eventually reached the end of the tunnel, and I stepped into a memory. Tia had set up a few lights in corners and on tables, but they did little more than give a ghostly cast to the large, dark chamber. The room had settled at an angle, with the floor sloping downward. The skewed perspective only enhanced the surreal sensation of this place. I froze in the mouth of the tunnel. The room was as I remembered it, shockingly well preserved. Towering pillars, now made of steel, and scattered desks, counters, rubble. I could still make out the tile mosaic on the floor, though only its shape. Instead of marble and stone, it was now all a uniform shade of silver, broken by ridges and bumps. There was almost no dust, though some motes dodged lazily in the air, creating little halos around the white lanterns Tia had set up. Realizing that I was still standing in the mouth of the tunnel, I stepped down into the room. Oh, sparks, I thought, my chest constricting. I found my hands gripping my rifle, though I knew I was in no danger. The memories were coming back in a flood. In retrospect, Tia was explaining, I listened with only half an ear, I shouldn't have been surprised to find it so well preserved. Fault line's powers created a kind of cushion of earth as the room sank, and Steelheart turned almost all of that earth to metal. The other rooms in the building were destroyed in his assault on the bank, and they broke off as the structure sank. But this one, and the attached vault, were ironically preserved by Steelheart's own powers. By coincidence, we'd entered through the front of the bank. There had been wide, beautiful glass doors here. Those had been destroyed in the gunfire and energy blasts. Steel rubble and some steel bones from Death Point's victims littered the ground to both sides. As I stepped forward, I followed the path Steelheart had taken into the building. Those are the counters, I thought, looking directly ahead. The ones where the tellers worked. One section had been destroyed. As a child, I'd crawled through that gap before making my way to the vault. The ceiling nearby was broken and misshapen, but the vault itself had been steel before Steelheart's intervention. Now that I thought about it, that might have helped preserve its contents because of how his transversion abilities worked. Most of the rubble is from when the ceiling fell in, Tia said from behind, her voice echoing in the vast chamber. Abraham and I cleaned out as much as we could. A large amount of dirt had tumbled through the broken wall and ceiling, filling one part of the chamber over by the vault. We used the tensors on that pile, then made a hole in the corner of the floor. It opens into a pocket of space underneath the building, and shoved the dust in there. I moved down 3 steps to the lower section of the floor. Here, in the center of the room, was where Steelheart had faced Death Point. These people are mine. By instinct, I turned to the left. Huddling beside the pillar, I found the body of the woman whose child had been killed in her arms. I shivered. She was now a statue made of steel. When had she died? How? I didn't remember. A stray bullet, maybe? She wouldn't have been turned to steel unless she'd already been dead. What really saved this place, Tia continued, was the Great Transversion, when Steelheart turned everything in the city to steel. If he hadn't done that, dirt would have filled this room completely. Beyond that, the settling of the ground probably would have caved in the ceiling. However, the transversion turned the remaining things in the room to steel, as well as the earth around it. In effect, he locked the room into place, preserving it like a bubble in the middle of a frozen pond. I continued forward until I could see the sterile little mortgage cubicle I'd hidden in. Its windows were now opaque, but I could see in through the open front. I walked in and ran my fingers along the desk. The cubicle felt smaller than I remembered. The insurance records were inconclusive, Tia continued, but there was a claim submitted on the building itself, an earthquake claim. I wonder if the bank owners really thought the insurance company would pay out on that. Seems ridiculous, but of course there was still a lot of uncertainty surrounding epics in those days. Anyway, that made me investigate records surrounding the bank's destruction. And that led you here? Cody asked, his voice coming from the darkness as he poked around the perimeter of the room. No, actually. It led me to find something curious. A cover-up. The reason I couldn't find anything in the insurance reports And why I couldn't find any lists of what was in the vault was because some of Steelheart's people had already gathered and hidden the information. I realized that since he had made a dedicated attempt to cover this up, I would never discover anything of use in the records. Our only chance would be to come to the bank, which Steelheart had assumed was buried beyond reach. It's a good assumption, Cody said, sounding thoughtful. Without the tensors, or some kind of epic power like the diggers had, getting here would have been near impossible. Burrowing through 50 feet of solid steel? The diggers had started out as normal humans and had been granted their strange powers by an epic known as Digzone, who was a gifter like Conflux. It hadn't gone well for them. Not all epic powers were meant to be used by mortal hands, it appeared.